The German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt once said, and quite famously at that, "In politics, whoever has visions should go to a doctor." Now, it was typical of the pragmatic German Chancellor to articulate this in the way he did. Big thinking and inspiring rhetoric does not necessarily marry with the compromise-driven pragmatism that typifies post-war German democracy. It's a lesson that Schmidt's successors have learned all too well. And no one exemplified German pragmatism and cold-bloodedness more than Angela Merkel, the second longest ruling chancellor of post-war Germany. So when Merkel's successor, the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, stepped up at the lectern at Prague's Charles University earlier this week to deliver a keynote speech on the future of Europe, as he put it, expectations were not particularly high. A landmark speech, or Germany's grand plan for Europe, of course, was long overdue, but the Germans are not really the ones who have grand visions for Europe, as was articulated by Schmidt. That is a job left to the French. In fact, if you remember Emmanuel Macron's Strasbourg address right after his recent election victory, in which the French president laid out his plans for greater European coordination, whether it was fiscal, defense, climate, and of course immigration policy. And in the months after that landmark speech, Macron's inner circle could barely hide their frustration with their German counterparts. In fact, the French believed that the German thinking was too small, too narrow-minded, and far too pragmatic. Without the joint will of European Union's Franco-German engine, the two biggest economies, the two biggest countries in the EU, major reform is nearly impossible. On Crux Decode, what is Germany's vision of a new Europe? Will Olaf Scholz be able to work together with Macron and other leaders in the European Union to address the greatest challenge to the very idea of Europe since the establishment of the EU? And most importantly, what will Europe do to ensure the ideas of Vladimir Putin, which are antagonistic to the ideas of Europe, will never prevail? In his speech in Prague, Scholz acknowledged the groundwork that was done by both his predecessors as also France. He explicitly invoked the beloved notion of European sovereignty. He said, and I quote, "When, if not now, will we create a sovereign Europe that can assert itself in a multipolar world?" That was Scholz's question. No doubt, observers across Europe were amused by the sight of a German chancellor talking about a unified Europe. But that's not all. Scholz went further. He echoed Macron and his idea to deepen formal cooperation between EU and non-EU states through what he called the European political community. Now, for most part, these proposals that were put forth by Scholz were either anodyne, they were old, they were unrealistic, or they were simply versions of things that have already been said by his predecessors or by folks in Europe. This is basically to cement Europe as a world leader, whether it's in climate protection or in high-tech manufacturing. Also to expand the European Union to encompass the current candidate members from the Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, and of course, eventually in the long run, countries like Georgia, Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now, some of his other moves, though, were much more bolder and much more controversial. Number one, expanding the EU membership to as many as 36 countries. Now this, Scholz acknowledged, would require some far-reaching changes in the Union's organizational as well as administrative processes. It would mean the EU would have to forsake one of its cornerstone principles, that is unanimity amongst all members for any major decision, and instead it'll have to go for a majority-based decision-making process. Also, having EU commissioners. Now remember, there is one EU commissioner from each member state. Scholz has been calling for sharing of responsibilities. But these proposals were also laced with a great degree of caution. After all, the European Union's smaller members are not likely to voluntarily give up their veto powers. Still, it would be a mistake to dismiss the significance of Scholz's speech entirely. For there was more at play in the speech than what was mentioned in the specific proposals. Of particular consequence is how the German Chancellor articulated what he sees as his country's place in an expanded and more East-centric European Union. His catchphrase in Prague was solidarity, and the choice of this word, solidarity, was surely not accidental. Among some of Germany's neighbors, the word solidarity carries a bit of a sinister tone, and that's because at the height of the financial crisis a decade ago, European solidarity meant that Germany was often using solidarity as a byword for imposing crippling economic sanctions or belt-tightening measures. So countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal have not forgotten the humiliation that they had to undergo. By contrast, there was a certain degree and a tone of humility, if you will, in the way Scholz addressed Germany's European partners. In particular, his remark that in the areas of immigration and fiscal policy, ideology has to give way to pragmatism. Now, that could be read as some degree of German repentance for the imperiousness during the Merkel era. And by saying that Europe's center is shifting eastwards, Scholz is holding out the assurance to Eastern Europeans that they will not be treated like second-class citizens. The war in Ukraine, of course, is what has given this speech its very heavy import. By focusing on the fundamentals, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, it has injected an evident sense of urgency into European matters. Along the way, the Europeans have generously taken in Ukrainian refugees, they've collaboratively recalibrated the energy supply of the continent. Scholz has also declaimed that we have breathed new life into the word European solidarity. Now, to take the German Chancellor at his word, one would have to imagine that the war has changed everything. Now, a lot has been written about the so-called Zeitenwende, which is the change of era that was announced by Scholz in an extraordinary session of the Bundestag just 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. This would mean a new, muscular German presence in European affairs. In fact, defense spending has been up to over $100 billion, something that Germany has never done post-World War II. So the Zeitenwende provided the impetus for Scholz's boldest and most consequential intervention, that is, locating security and defense at the very heart of the European project. In the view of the German Chancellor, the war in Ukraine demands a complete transformation in how Europe must see itself. A European Union which began as an inward-looking peace project must now concentrate on its external threats. Scholz has also proposed a European air defense system in which he says Germany would invest heavily. He's also called for an independent council of Europe's defense ministers, much like the ones in environment and in agriculture. The European Union would in addition have its rapid reaction force ready by 2025. In the end, what was perhaps the most consequential fact about Scholz's speech in Prague was not necessarily the specific contents of his speech, but the mere fact that it took place at all. Behind the characteristically dull and bureaucratic delivery was the promise of a new approach to Germany's relationships with its European neighbors and partners. Perhaps, after all, this was indeed a vision, albeit it was expressed in a very German way.